might help. The meeting is being live streamed on the City Council YouTube channel so that the public can observe the meeting without needing to be present. Could I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves? If we could start from my left, and can you mute your microphone when you finish?
I'm Caroline Harris and I'm a Principal Planner in the Sites and Policies team.
Good afternoon, I'm Paul Bingham. I'm Team Leader in Data and Intelligence in Policy and Plans.
Good afternoon, I'm Councillor Paul Ray. I'm the Chair of South and West Plans.
Good afternoon, Councillor Peter Carlill, Calverley and Farsley Ward.
Councillor Jonathan Pryor, Heading Lane Hyde Park Ward and Executive Member for Economy, Transport and Sustainable Development.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Javid Akhtar, London and Woodhouse Ward, and also Chair for the North and East Plan Panel.
Afternoon, everyone. Councillor Jess Lennox, Exec Board Member for Housing, which takes in housing growth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Alan Lamb from Wetherby Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Barry Anderson, Adelaide Wharfdale Ward.
Good afternoon, Toby Russell, Clerk to the panel.
Afternoon, Nicole Walker, Legal Advisor to the panel.
Hello, Martin Elliott. I'm Head of Strategic Planning.
Good afternoon, Adam Harvat, Group Manager for Policy and Plans.
Thank you, everybody. Can I ask the clerk to run through the first 5 items on the agenda, please?
Yep, thank you, Chair. So item number 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Item number 2, there are no items which would require the exclusion of the press or the public. Item number 3, there's no formal late items. Item number 4, can I ask members to declare any interests? Thank you. And item number 5, apologies for absence have been received from Councillor Campbell, Councillor Finnegan and Councillor Hesselwood. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, item number 6, minutes of the previous meeting held on the 30th of January 2024. Those members who were on this panel then? Okay. I'll assume they're correct unless anybody says. Everybody's happy with those? Thank you. Okay, before we do move to the first substantive item, just want to say a few introductory words. We have a good mix of members on this panel, and some returning members with plenty of experience, and others like me, where this is the first meeting on this panel. In that spirit, I've asked officers to dedicate a little bit of time in their presentations to setting the scene and summarising some of the history of how we've got here, and also explain some of the terminology, which to me is a bit new. I think it will be for some of the others as well. Just gets everybody all members on the same page. Officers should therefore expect some questions along these lines from the new members, and I want those new members to feel comfortable in asking those questions. There are no stupid questions. If you don't know, please do ask. Okay, we shall move on to item number 7, update report on the local plan. Your city, your neighbourhood, your planet, and it's page 15 in your agenda packs.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take members through this presentation. So yes, this is on the local plan update 1. And just as a way of kind of setting the scene, I just wanted to explain a little bit for those members who are a little less familiar with it, the kind of what the local plan update is doing in terms of the local plan, where it sits at the moment, and where we're hoping to move it to. And just to put that document and the next item in terms of the Leeds Local Plan 2040 in a bit more context. So the documents you see in the middle of your screen are those that make up our current development plan, and they set a vision for how Leeds should grow. A real focus on brownfield land and regeneration. We've got 5 documents there. So we've got the Unitary Development Plan, the Air Valley Leeds Area Action Plan, the Core Strategy, the Site Allocations Plan, and the Natural Resources and Waste Plan. So it's quite a suite of different documents. And I think in looking at that suite produced over many years, there was a recognition that we wanted to move towards a more streamlined, easier to understand and easier to kind of access local plan. So we are proposing to update that plan in two ways. So the first is through item 1, which is the local plan update 1. The second is through Leeds Local Plan 2040, which my colleague Caroline Harris will take us through a little bit later. So some of those highlights on the left-hand side there in terms of the amount of employment land that's been, in terms of our requirements for employment land, our requirements for office space, our requirements for housing. They're based on the existing local plan. The new local plan will be re-looking at those numbers and re-looking at whether they're the right numbers for Leeds. And where they should go in broad terms. In terms of the local plan update, this is a plan that's really focused on the climate emergency, and it has in its origins the 2019 climate emergency declaration at full council, and a requirement as part of that declaration that local plan policy should be updated to take account of it. So over the last few years, this panel obviously has been working on that document, obviously with officers pulling those policies together, the evidence together, with 5 broad strands, which is carbon reduction, flood risk, green and blue infrastructure, placemaking, and sustainable infrastructure. So what that means is we're looking towards energy efficient homes that are zero carbon, developments that are that resilience to flooding or avoid it. Increased protection for our natural environment and formal green space. As part of that, also improvements to placemaking and design, and a broader support for sustainable infrastructure through support for things like mass transit and new rail connections. I just wanted to take members through some of these images. They'll be familiar to some, but not to others. And don't worry too much if you can't read them. It is small type. But these are examples of the documents that we consulted on in terms of the Regulation 19 consultation. So they're what we call the plan on a page. So it's a way of just summarising what each topic area was trying to do. So the carbon reduction one, which is the first topic, again, just to summarise, so we're looking at not just net zero developments, but whole life cycle carbon emissions, sustainable construction standards, renewable energy generation, policies about heat networks and energy storage. In terms of flood risk, we're looking at policies towards the functional floodplain, the impact of climate change on our modelling, breach modelling, safe routes of access and escape, sustainable drainage systems and making space for water. In terms of green and blue infrastructure, things like increased tree planting, enhanced protection and enhancing green space, increasing biodiversity through biodiversity net gain and local food production. And in terms of placemaking chapter, real emphasis on increasing the quality of design, the health impacts of developments, also policies on resisting drive-throughs where appropriate. And we have some terminology there in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods that has now moved to complete, compact, connected places. But otherwise, a lot of those messages in terms of how we walk to amenities and facilities and how sustainable sites are is a really important part of this plan. And finally, mass transit, sustainable infrastructure, which includes support for mass transit, new rail infrastructure, the development of Leeds Station. The policy on digital connectivity has been overtaken by building regulations, so it's no longer required. So as I say, these slides are a point in time. They were what we consulted on a year or so ago, but I just thought they were a useful summary of where we were and where we've got to. Over recent months, as you'll see in the papers, the plan has potentially been significantly affected by the 2023 December written ministerial statement, which sets out that local authorities shouldn't go beyond building regulations. And if they do, they should do so in a way that's consistent with what's called the target emissions rate, which is a specific way of calculating carbon emissions. That specific way is not the way that the draft plan seeks to calculate carbon emissions. Our members who have been members of this panel for some time will remember that that EUI approach, energy use intensity, was more than just carbon. It was also about trying to make homes cheap to heat, to live in, to power, by being as energy efficient as possible. So I think it's certainly disappointing in terms of where we've got that policy to, the effect the written ministerial statement has on it. We are of the view that the EUI approach is the best approach, but it may not be possible to continue down that line for us to be consistent with written ministerial statement. As it says in the papers, the written ministerial statement is national policy. For a plan to be found sound, it has to be consistent with national policy. So subject to the appeal, that WMS has been found lawful as of essentially a fortnight ago. So that is now national policy. In addition to that, officers have spent the last few months going through consultation comments that were received in December, but also revising policies, not just in light of those consultation comments, but also considering how we can respond to the written ministerial statement. We will then use those draft policies to have a final round of viability assessment, which will hopefully, give us a really instructive way forward and a final way forward. Those policies will then be presented to yourselves. It's also worth noting that whilst this paper was accurate at the time of writing, there's obviously, even just last week, we had some changes in national policy in terms of onshore wind. We have draft policies in the plan about onshore wind, so it's likely that we might need to revise those policies in response to those changes. And I think the more changes that come through at a national level, the more likelihood there is of further revisions being required. So that's something that we're just going to have to keep under review, which again is I hope made clear in the papers. That being said, we hope that we can do a final round of consultation this year. That'll depend on the timing of announcements at a national level, of course. And the plan would be to submit the plan very shortly after the close of that consultation. So I think that's where we are, Chair, in terms of the local plan update. So happy to take kind of any comments and questions on that, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks, Adam. Any comments or queries? Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I was slightly late. I forgot about the graduation. Can I just touch on the written ministerial statement and the problem it's caused us? Well, there are two questions. One is, are by definition written ministerial statements effectively, do they have the backing of the law? So the current minister could theoretically, presumably produce another written statement, which we might then have to alter things for. And I suppose by default, does the thing about wind farms come under that broad heading? And I suppose the other question is, does the ministerial statement constrain anything else that we've got within the draft?
Thanks, Councillor Campbell. I think there's a bit of a kind of case law on this, but in terms of whether it is the written ministerial statement is law versus policy, it's very much policy. It's not law. It can't change legal statute. And to be fair, I think that was quite a lot of what the High Court case was trying to establish. I think it was only found that it was lawful because the judge in that case found it was consistent with the law. So it is policy. So you're absolutely right. If a new minister wanted to come in and either revoke it or rewrite it, they would be well within their rights to do so. The same is also true for the wind farm change. It's a change to the MPPF, so it's obviously national policy. It's obviously a major consideration for the plan because, as I say, the plan to be found sound has to be consistent with national policy, and it's clear that certainly on the wind farm side of things, that's a clear expression of the current government's policy. So that's not likely to change. does the WMS affect other things? I think primarily it affects EN1B, which is why I included that as an appendix to the paper, just because I think hopefully you can see through that the expression of how we're using energy use intensity and how kind of central that is to the policy. I think consequentially, there may be other impacts on, say, the sustainable construction policy. I think they're less pronounced, but I think it is possible that they would have an impact on that. I think wherever you're setting a standard that goes beyond building regulations and isn't consistent with the target emissions rate approach, that's inconsistent with the WMS. So we've done that read through. We're confident the main effect is on EN1B, but I think it's possible there are impacts on the sustainable construction policy too.
Councillor Carlo?
Thank you. Yeah, it's on the same topic because we've been around this a few times now, I think, around the written ministerial statement. And the real risk, I think, is just in that energy use. My concern is obviously that not restricting energy use in some way, or rather than restricting, let's say, not encouraging people to reduce the required energy use of a building, makes it much harder for the grid to be decarbonised, and therefore kind of puts the nation's plans and the government's plans at somewhat of a risk. One of the other things we noted in that was that Manchester were progressing with a similar policy that we felt also would be outside of the written ministerial statement. Do we have any updates in terms of what they are looking to do, so that we can see whether that sets a precedent?
So it was quite interesting in the Manchester case. They appeared to, I'm not sure what the technical word is, but fudge it seemed to be the more accurate word. But there was a kind of halfway house where I think they retained elements of the EUI approach, but the inspector didn't fully endorse it. So I think there's potentially a risk that they have a policy that they can't necessarily implement the way that they intended to. Now, what was useful about the High Court case was that it did make clear that if before that point, as in before the judgment, you have an adopted policy that uses EUIs, then you should still be able to use them, but the weight to be given to it will be balanced against national policy. So you can at least still make that argument. I think the risk for us, unfortunately, is that get out didn't appear to apply to draft policies. It only applied to adopted ones. We understand from other authorities that are a bit further ahead than we are, but further behind than Manchester were, that they are feeling compelled to not use the EUI approach. We can certainly do a little more investigating just to see what their absolute latest position is and bring that back for information. But my understanding is that the message they're getting from their inspectors is quite clearly to use the target emissions rate approach, because that is now quite clearly national policy.
Is yours on the same thing? Okay, go on then, Paul.
I suppose the question is, obviously that's policy. How's the market going to respond? And have we had any indications from developers of actually how they will respond to? Because it's one thing having a national policy in place, but if they decide to go down a different route because it's more advantageous in the long term commercially, have we had any soundings from the sector yet?
I think there's probably not a consistent voice, I think it's fair to say. I think there's a lot of broad support for the broad direction that we're going in, that the council are going in. I think there are some specific concerns about things like energy use intensity from parts of the sector, because it's simply not something that they've done before. And those authorities that have already adopted those standards, there aren't that many, or the operators that we're aware of don't operate in those markets. We're aware, though, talking to, say, other parts of the sector, that there is a real understanding, certainly from groups like the UK Green Building Council, that if you want an accurate reflection of the energy use of a building, you use EUIs. You don't use the target emissions rate, because the target emissions rate is essentially based on a model which is proven to be inaccurate. It's not a real reflection of energy use. It's called a nominal building, essentially, or a notional building, and yeah, it's kind of proven not to be accurate. So I think the sector don't necessarily speak with one voice. I think what is clear from the written ministerial statement is that there were concerns from the sector that there are going to be different standards across the country, and that might make it harder for them to respond to, say, a policy in Wakefield compared to a policy in Leeds. I think our view is that that doesn't need to be a major concern. And we're seeing more and more authorities wanting to use energy use intensity. So if that was allowed to continue, you'd get to that consistent place. So I think that concern is overstated, frankly. But nevertheless, that is the concern of the industry. So I think it's fair to reflect that.
Thank you. One of my things about this written ministerial statement is we've just changed government. We've got a government, excuse me, that said they're going to change planning regulations. So are we doing some work here in trying to adhere to the WMS, which may well change in the coming months? So I'd like to make a suggestion to the panel that we write to the planning minister and ask them to clarify their approach to this as soon as possible. And whether that comes from this panel or from Councillor Pryor as the exec board member, don't really mind which it is, whoever it's easiest. But I think we probably should raise this as an issue, and hopefully other authorities will be doing something similar. Councillor Campbell.
I think I would support that, Chair. I've actually got it down as the bottom of my list is what we're going to do about it. I mean, from our point of view, isn't it? And I think from the environmental point of view, the energy use intensity is the measure we should be using. And I can appreciate that house builders feel they need consistency, and I can understand why that might be. But I'm not sure about consistency at the lowest possible level. So I think I would support your view that we ask Councillor Pryor to write on our behalf to the Minister to encourage us to make another ministerial statement around energy use intensity.
Councillor Pryor.
Happy to tell the board that I had a discussion literally only yesterday about doing exactly that. I suspect a letter from me may be less neutral than a letter from this board, so I'm happy if you choose one from each, because I think a letter from me would express an opinion on what I wanted to happen rather than a simple clarification. But broadly, I had thought I'd wait until after the King's speech to see if anything was mentioned then, because otherwise the letter might just be superfluous. But given that, is that tomorrow? Tomorrow, yes, given that's tomorrow, that's not a huge amount of time to wait.
So is everybody happy we take both approaches, both one from Councillor Pryor and one from this panel, and leave that with myself and officers, and we'll circulate it, and Councillor Pryor will do what Councillor Pryor does with anything he sends off to ministers. Okay. Anything else on this presentation? Yeah, Councillor Ray.
I mean, this may come out in the change to national planning policy to come through the King's speech, and it's more of a mission. And I think I raised this in the previous meeting around. Obviously, we're talking about neighbourhoods and the city, etc., and plan forward. That gap in gentle density, which actually would serve quite a lot of our housing need and demand on land, and where we are in the process of looking forward to having a more robust plan around trying to encourage gentle density rather than what we have in Leeds, which is 1 or 2 story buildings, and then all of a sudden you get to Leeds city centre and it goes up to 30. And actually how we get, particularly in that social housing sector where we want to try and maximise the amount of truly affordable units.
Thank you, Councillor Ray. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are lots of different ways of achieving sustainability, aren't there? And I think putting people in places where services are, where connections are, is obviously a really effective way of doing that. I think this plan doesn't include any specific policies on that, but I think the next presentation we'll see in terms of Leeds Local Plan 2040 is the appropriate vehicle for that, because excuse me, it's about making decisions about how the city should grow, which is what that plan is doing. That's probably a segue, isn't it?
Anything else on this before we move on? Yes, Councillor Carlo.
Thank you. I guess just to end the point off, so we're in this bit of a middle ground, but we've been at a few stopping points with the local plan as we've been going through. Couple earlier on, then the written ministerial statement. Now we've got a new government and a new King's Speech and various other things. I guess maybe in a letter, if you write one, Chair, on behalf of this panel, maybe we could express our desire to get this through quite quickly, and that's why we need clarity. I think we've been wanting to get these through, and that's why we separated them from a full local plan update. In some ways, there may be points at which we want to say, well, let's remove that policy from this update and carry on with the rest of it in order so that the bulk of the policies are through. But I think we need real clarity on that. So I think that's something I'm just keen, and I guess it'd be good to get officers' take on this, that the next consultation is both soon and the last consultation on this matter, and then we end up with something that we feel is robust enough to not need much updating and working through or review since then. I don't know how we get that clarity, because we're in a very difficult position.
Thank you, Councillor Carl. Yeah, I mean, I think that is absolutely the position of officers. I think whilst plan making can often take a long time, we are keen for this to be an adopted plan. We think these are good policies that are getting the city in a much better position in terms of the quality of development. So we are really keen to see them adopted. And there is, I think, you can see in the kind of broad responses we've had to this plan throughout the consultation period is that there is a lot of support for these policies, notwithstanding some wrinkles in terms of the details of how they get implemented. So yeah, absolutely, we are keen to turn this sort of latest and hopefully last version around very quickly, and we'll bring it to this panel as soon as we can. But you're right to highlight that there is a risk sort of hovering over slightly in terms of the changes at a national level, and it would be very useful to get that clarity to make sure that we're not going in the wrong direction. The last thing that I think any of us would want is to have a policy that becomes inconsistent with national policy and then doesn't have much weight, and we're battling it, in your roles as panel members, battling to use policies that aren't consistent with national policy, and that puts you in an uncomfortable position and puts the sector in a confused position as well. So we're keen to make sure that what we do is consistent with that national picture. I think that's the best place for all of us to be in.
Last call on this item. Okay, we shall move on to item 8, progress update for Leeds Local Plan 2040. That's from page 27 in your agenda.
Thank you, Chair. There we go. So yeah, so much like Adam has done with the local plan update, I'll sort of just take you through a bit of the background to what we've been doing so far on the Leeds Local Plan 2040, and then sort of the emerging sort of evidence and thoughts that are coming forward on that. I've got 11 slides in total, so I'm happy to sort of pause as we're going through to take questions, or take questions at the end. Either way works for me, but we can maybe go through and see how we find it. You could next slide, please, Adam. Yes, I think as Adam's sort of set out, the local plan really sets out the sort of the overall framework for how much development takes place, where it happens, and what the requirements for that development are. And obviously planning applications need to be determined in accordance with the plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And I think as as Adam's explained, plans are prepared through a sort of multi-stage process. And whilst the sort of local plan update is a relatively advanced stage in the process, the Leeds Local Plan 2040 is at a much earlier stage of that process. So we did a consultation at the start of last year on the sort of overall scope of the plan, which I'll talk about a bit more in a second. And the sort of the next milestone that we're working towards is a sort of a further consultation on what the sort of the broad issues for that plan, what it needs to address, and the options for doing so. So we're sort of at an early stage in what can be quite a long plan making process. Oh, next slide, please. Sorry, I'm pressing it on my screen that's not doing anything. Yeah, it's quite disconcerting. So as I said, we did a consultation on the scope of Leeds Local Plan 2040 between February and March last year. And I guess whilst the local plan update is a sort of very focused plan focusing on the climate emergency, the Leeds Local Plan 2040 is the sort of the wider update looking at, I guess, everything else. And so as part of the scope of that plan, what we took out to consultation was a proposal that the plan focuses on 7 key topics. So that being the overall spatial strategy about how much development needs to happen, where that should take place. And I think that brings in things like density, what the sort of density of development in different locations and how much happens in different places. As part of that, it'll be looking at housing, so making sure that we've got the right type, size, tenure of housing in different parts of the city to meet the needs of people, residents in the city. Also looking at economic development, so looking at the space needed for new expanding businesses. But looking at the role of the city centre and local centre and sort of responding to that changing role of the high street and local centres and sort of doing what the planning system can to support their viability and vitality. But also as part of that, we're also looking at things like specialist topics like minerals and waste. So planning for how much minerals need to be extracted over the period to 2040 and the provisions in place for the processing of waste. As well as more broadly looking at sort of transport and connectivity. And again, it's sort of the role of the planning system as part of a wider transport planning approach with sort of colleagues in highways, looking about how we can enable people to travel by more sustainable options and planning for development in the most sustainable locations. And alongside that, we're also sort of looking at updating and introducing other policies which sort of address a wide range of other policy areas. So things like heritage, landscape, all these sort of detailed policies which are really important to ensuring high quality development in the city. Alongside that consultation, we also launched what's called a call for sites, which allowed anyone to suggest sites that they'd like to be considered as part of preparing the plan. So landowners, developers, members of the public could all go onto the website. There was a map they could draw on, where the site was that they thought should be considered. And that's kind of gone into the pool of sites that we'll be looking at. And again, I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. As part of that consultation, we did a range of activities to sort of raise awareness and discuss the proposals. I think we were quite keen, because this is a very early stage in the plan making process, to sort of target activities at those that would raise awareness of the plan. So we had drop-ins at high footfall locations. We went to sort of the Trinity Centre, Merrion Centre, Kirkgate Market at the weekends, big stall banners, trying to just let people know that this was something that was happening. We wanted to get people's views about what they would like to see happen in Leeds in the future. But we also, as part of that, also went to meetings with various neighbourhood planning groups and a number of more targeted events. So we sort of attended a neurodiversity event. We went to meet with the Leeds Deaf Forum, did some events in schools and so on. So sort of much more targeted activities as well as part of that. And overall, the consultation resulted in about 4,500 visitors to the website and about just under 1,000 responses, which I think at this sort of high level stage where we're not talking about the specifics of exactly what is proposed, I think we were relatively happy with that level of response. And through the call for sites, we got about 508 sites submitted for consideration through that process. Move to the next slide. Yeah, so just in terms of the sort of headlines.
Can I just ask a question on that one? Because you said we could ask you a question.
Yeah.
You just go back one. I'm looking at number 2, housing, and I've raised this before, and I suppose I'll continue to raise it. In that it says ensuring the right type, size, tenure of housing is developed to meet needs. we currently, and I think those of us who sit on city plans in particular, will note the comment about 3-bedroom properties within the city centre. And I suppose if you sit on south and west or east, you talk about 5-bedroom houses out in the suburbs. Can we couch the plan in such a way as to make our ability to, I was going to say, be more prescriptive about that comment, the type, the tenure, etc. Because at the moment we find it very, very difficult to actually persuade developers that our policy has a basis, and therefore we think that should be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a sort of within the existing core strategy, we have a policy on housing mix, but that sort of sets broad parameters of percentages which apply right across the city. And I think one of the things we've done in developing the evidence base for the local plan is we've commissioned a new strategic housing market assessment, which is a really detailed study looking at what the needs are for different types of development in different parts of the city. And I think one of the key changes that from this time round, I guess, as opposed to what we did last time, that's taking a very bottom-up approach, looking really right down to a local level about what different needs are in different parts of the city. And it gives us some really good local evidence, which I think what we'll be able to do through this next plan is really tailor that policy much more to, so rather than having perhaps standard proportions of different mixes that apply across the city, we can potentially look at tailoring that to different parts of the city, recognising that perhaps the mix that's needed in the city centre might be different to that in outer areas. So the policy reflects what's needed in different parts of the city. So I think it can be a lot more responsive.
Well, I think from my point of view, I'd like us to do that because the across the city principle, and I know on more than one occasion various of us have asked the question, well, have we got any across the city evidence? And we can never produce that evidence because obviously it's difficult to measure. So housing characteristic area, I suppose specifics will be much better for us to understand. I think for developers to understand, and it will be easier for plans panels to enforce.
Absolutely. So if I carry on then, so just in terms of the headlines, I think this is really just a flavour. As you imagine, we got 1,000 responses. There was an awful lot of detail then, but I think in overall, I think there was good support for the proposed scope of the local plan and positive feedback on the consultation material as a whole. But yes, as you'd expect, there's a wide range of views expressed about what it should or shouldn't say about all of these topics, and I think that's what we'll be looking at as we sort of go forward in developing the plan. And I think what we're going to do as part of the consultation material that we produce for the next consultation, as part of each section, we'll have a what you told us section, so be able to be really clear to people who've commented at previous stages what they've said and how their comments are helping to shape the plan. I think providing that important feedback to people and also encouraging people that, you know, we are taking on board these comments that you're making to us, and they do really have a really important role in helping to shape the plan. But at a very headline level, I think it's striking to note that 87% of the respondents to the survey thought it was important to meet local needs for development, which I think is a positive, a recognition that, you know, what we're doing for the local plan is important for the city and is important for meeting local needs. And as part of that, the need for additional affordable housing came across particularly strongly. I think a real recognition that is something that we need more of in the city. I think set against that, it was also interesting to note about 63% of people were concerned about development taking place in their area. So whilst there's a recognition that development needs to happen, concerns about where it might happen. But sort of digging into that a bit more, I think there was a majority of people felt they'd be more likely to support development if it took place on brownfield land, or if it was sort of providing wider benefits as part of that development. I think the majority of the people who responded to the survey were opposed to considering changes to the greenbelt boundaries to accommodate development. So there was some nuances to that when you're sort of looking at, I think, more acceptance of considering that for specialist needs like affordable housing or other types of specialist housing needs, as opposed to sort of market housing as a whole. So again, something we're going to need to reflect on as we're sort of progressing with the plan. And again, coming back to that concept of complete, compact, connected places, encouraging people, supporting them to live locally, be able to access local services facilities. I think that was something which again was quite strongly supported through the consultation.
Before you move on, Councillor Ray.
Yeah, it's just to pick up on that 63% were concerned about development taking place in their area, and you've mentioned with some of the other bits there was nuances to it. Are there geographical nuances to that in terms of actually where those responses have come from? Because obviously that will obviously be telling. I expect someone who lives right on the greenbelt to probably be more resistive to development than someone that lives dead in the city centre. So what kind of level of nuance is there in those responses? Were there clear geographical indicators, shall we say?
So when, as part of the survey, we did ask people where they lived, sort of give the context to that. And when we were asking this question, we also asked the reasons why that was. So, you know, what are your specific concerns about development? I think it was varied across the board. I think we haven't done detailed analysis looking at exactly how that question maps to geographical areas, but yeah, I think if you were to do that, that you would see differences in different. I guess it's your context, isn't it, to where how you understand what the impact it might have.
I mean, the reason why I raise it is in one sense, it says 63% are concerned about development, but actually, if that's 80% in one area and 10% in another, that is vastly different. So that nuance and that granular data is actually really important if you're having an informed policy discussion in development about a plan. So, you know, even if it's somehow we can extract rough locations via IP addresses, for example, that information is really, really powerful for developing policy.
Thank you, Chair. It's on the same point, and Martin might back me up on this, but we've had interesting conversations around this. We had a parish forum engagement that Martin came to, and it really depends what the nature of the conversation. So if you're asking about people's current experience of development in our area, in an outer area where it's predominantly executive homes on greenfield sites with no supporting infrastructure, people are very resistant to more of that. If the conversation is about delivering affordable homes in accessible locations with supporting infrastructure, so people can stay in their community, older people can downsize and so on, you get a different response. And if it's just the lived experience at the minute is negative, that doesn't mean people don't want to see more houses in the area. It's the nature of the housing and the infrastructure that goes with it.
Thanks to both councillors there. I think we can certainly go away and do that more granular analysis as you suggest, Councillor Ray. I think both, you know, Councillor Ray will be right in your positions there, that I think a lot of it is your lived experience, and also where you are. I think partly, not to bring this back to local plan update 1, but that's also one of the bigger drivers for that plan as well, is that quality of development, because we'll see, and Martin, you know, can speak to this in terms of the nationally, you know, how supportive people are of new housing in their areas, and their views on the quality of new housing is really low. You know, there is not a lot of support. There's not a lot of kind of trust of either the development industry or local planning authorities, for that matter. And what we were trying, one of the drivers for that plan was to try and raise that quality so that people could start to see and be proud of new development in their areas, and therefore be more supportive of it when it's suggested in their place. Now we've got a long way to go there, obviously, but obviously, you know, we all have a role in that. But yeah, we can certainly take that away and try and do that more granular analysis.
I wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said. I'm surprised it's as low as 63% in certain. The government, in one of their first announcements around planning, sort of talked about a tweaking of the differentiation between brownfield, greenfield, green belt, and
grey belts.
And grey belt, that was the one. And I just wonder, we are writing, if we can get a better definition of what grey belt might be, because obviously that might, when we come to look at the sites, that's going to affect how we perhaps score them in relation to a development potential.
I'll start answering this, but I know Martin's been quite across this, so anything I miss, I'm sure Martin will be able to come in. Yeah, we don't quite know what that definition means yet. There's obviously been talk about things like say car parks in the green belt, or say disused brownfield land in the green belt being examples of grey belt, quote unquote. We understand we're going to get a new kind of revision of the MPPF, I think tomorrow, or sorry, no, Thursday. So hopefully there'll be a bit more clarity on what that means. I suspect it's that lower quality green belt in terms against the purposes of green belt, and I think we're in a good position for that. You know, as Caroline can probably take us through in more detail later. You know, we're looking at a green belt. Well, we're currently undertaking a green belt review in terms of looking at parcels of land and assessing them against the purposes of green belt. So unless the government change those purposes of green belt, I think we're in a pretty good position to respond to any change of that. I think broadly speaking, you know, the current system allows for, through the plan making process, the redesignation of greenbelt land and allocation for development. And obviously the council has done that, and many other councils across the country do that too. They do it through an examination process, and that's the appropriate vehicle for it to be done. So I think we need to understand a little bit more about what the practical implications are for plan making. I don't know, Martin, if you wanted to. No, that's fine.
Sorry, just one thing, that the corollary of that is that in order to change the green belt, you need exceptional circumstances, some of which include there are no alternative sites that are as sustainable to deliver that development. So Adam and team are spending a lot of time looking at urban capacity, looking at brownfield land to make sure that we're really squeezing as much as we can out of those alternatives to green belt before any green belt is considered in this plan.
Thank you. Sorry, I was going to say this till later, but it fits in here because there is a real distinction in a way of looking at those. Because I mean, I've looked at the sites that have been submitted in my area, and an outer ward. It's no surprise to me that I think of a dozen of them. I think at least 10 greenbelt sites. Now I could look at those quite easily as a ward member. Well, I could take a view. Well, we'll have no development in my area whatsoever because the majority of the sites are greenbelt. But I could look at a couple of those sites and say that has no discernible value. The difficulty is how we separate that out as a council and how we prove that. So there will be areas on here where I can say, you know, there's areas that's a former garden centre that is looks like a brownfield site but is in the green belt. Nobody's going to come and turn it into lush green fields again. So the best for that site is for the garden centre to continue to develop, or for something else to develop on that site. For instance, there are other areas where they're in the green belt because they're near the edge of what was there before, but there's no benefit to them. I would much rather there be a choice of which one than it be up to the developers to come and pick, or that we put all the sites in. So I think that distinction's really necessary to make, and the distinction will be important in the same way. Yet the only people that have built one-bed flats in my area are the council. I can't think of any other one-bed properties that have been built in my area, apart from maybe an old mill that's been redesigned, but everything else will be 4 and 5 bedroom houses. I think people will be very happy to say, yes, but that green belt site will be used for a residential home or for smaller affordable properties, something we really need, rather than another 200 executive homes that we have quite a lot of already. And for some reason, they're twice the price of the existing houses. That I don't know why somebody buys one for 700,000 when my house was a lot cheaper than that and probably is better built. But that's the distinction, and I think hopefully we'll get some clarity on that, because I can absolutely see where that's going, because otherwise there would be no development in my ward, and I'm sure other colleagues' wards as is. But at the moment, there's no clarity, is there, on which sites we would seek to add in. There's very difficult to get clarity to residents then on which sites may get developed on and which may not.
I can absolutely see, certainly at this stage in the process, that can cause a little bit of uncertainty. I suppose what we don't want to do is rush to, well, we've decided what the best sites are, tell us what you think. I think it's important, as Martin described, in terms of exceptional circumstances, that you go through a really robust process. One of the first parts of that process, as Martin described, is the work that Paul led on in terms of the urban capacity study. That's your first start. What land have you got in kind of those brownfield areas, which don't often get submitted to us? You know, we kind of have to go through an exercise to try and find those, because if you owned that land, you can do almost anything with it already. So there isn't a massive advantage to getting it allocated, which is why you'll see through a call for sites exercise, the vast majority on greenbelt sites, because that's where you need the plan to take it out of the greenbelt. You don't need a piece of land that's, say, in the city centre to be allocated for anything. You can already do it. So that's why that you see that real imbalance on those kind of maps. I think to try and provide some comfort as well in terms of that greenbelt exercise, we've stripped out the site submissions from it. It's looking at parcels of land that we've come up with as kind of officers through a robust process informed by other councils that we know have been found sound. So that doesn't only look at the sites we've had submitted to us, that looks at the land around kind of all settlements, kind of on a neutral basis. And again, as I said, looks at it against the purposes of Greenbelt, which is, we think, the only way you really can look at it. Sorry, I'm probably stealing some of Caroline's thunder here. But yeah, just to provide that comfort, I think that's the way we're looking at it, rather than saying, okay, we've had some land submitted outside of Carberley, let's have a look at it in terms of its greenbelt function. That's not the first stage for us. The first stage is, let's just look at the land as a true greenbelt review. And I think that will be consistent with what the government are wanting us to do in terms of greenbelt review. But obviously we await with interest that clarification. I don't know, Caroline, sorry if I've stolen it.
Councillor Ray.
Yeah, it's just reflecting on the point you said about obviously the brownfield sites and them not necessarily coming forward because you can pretty much do any of them, but also in the context of the review of the parcel land for the green site, one of the challenges currently, as you say, is to make sure there's not another viable site nearby. So I suppose the question is very much as we did with the tree survey for the city. Is there any use of digital mapping technology and AI to basically take a picture of the city from above and actually proactively identify those? Because if developers aren't coming forward for them and they form part of the conversation when we're making an assessment about, particularly in the greenbelt areas or grey belt, or whatever we're going to be defined as, actually does something meet the qualifying criteria for change? But we don't actually have that on a piece of paper, as it were. How do we proactively find them? And are we using all the powers that technology now provides, particularly with AI, and has been shown with the digital surveys that we did for the trees to map tree coverage across the city? Are we using a similar approach, or could we use a similar approach if we're not doing so already?
If it's okay, I might bring in Paul here, because I think Paul would be pretty well placed to kind of describe the process that we took through the urban capacity study, if that's okay, Paul.
Yeah, so I don't think we've gone as far as you've described there in terms of using AI, but we have used a sort of systematic process, like looking at types of land use through the OS layers. It is all digitally mapped. So we started with all the OS parcels of land, what they were. So we discounted things like highways and things like that. We took it through, and then then it kind of got a bit more manual in terms of looking at what was on the site. We also sort of combined it with data we've got on vacancies and things like that, so we could sort of narrow down to vacant buildings and the plots around them and stuff like that. What we weren't finding a great deal of land that we didn't already know about. So most of the land you're seeing that's vacant and brown is already somewhere in the planning process as an allocation or a permission or something like that. But we've tried to be as thorough as we can. And I think there'll always be sites out there we don't know about, often because they become vacant or they're redeveloped as a existing active use and things like that. So I think we've tried to be thorough and systematic, and sort of can use that sort of layered approach to narrowing it down.
Councillor Akhtar.
Thank you, Chair. We all know there is a shortage of houses, and there's always a debate when we all like to see more houses getting built, Chair, but when it comes to our own backyard, we complain, and the residents complain. Now we need to have a balance. My ward and Councillor Ray ward, wherever there's a small piece of land, developers will start building 13, 14, 17-story high blocks. We are not short of any blocks in our neck of the wood, but I think we need to have a balance, so, and monitor for the family houses, and that's the point I'm trying to make. That green sites, yes, with on special circumstances, but in inner areas we also need to play some sort of attention as well. I mean, like city centre, Little London and South Leeds, near the riverside, we've got enough blocks now. There are families living in these areas as well, and we need to consider those families.
Can I just dive in at this point, because this goes back to what I was saying about the type of house, and the reason that families struggle in certain parts of the city to find somewhere to live is because there isn't that unit. Now, the perception in England, isn't it, is that when you buy a house, you buy a semi or a detached and with a garden and space for 2 cars and all the rest of it. And that's the vision. But actually, that's not the reality in a lot of cases. And I think it's fair to say, isn't it, in the city centre and those surrounding areas, there is a huge demand for accommodation, and there's a demand for high density accommodation. Now, that high density accommodation doesn't have to be built in such a way as to be what's the word I'm looking for, that discourages families. And I think we've failed pretty abysmally, actually, in my opinion, to develop within that housing boom that's taken place accommodation that's suitable for families. We've talked about it a lot, but we've never really done it because we've never been prepared, I suppose, to take on some developers and to say, no, these units need an element where families can live. And if you have a family, you need other things as well. And that includes my ever popular comment in relation to amenity space. If we don't provide amenity space, you are not going to move in there with your kids. And it's that whole thing, isn't it? It's that perception. And if you look at many of the cities in mainland Europe, people live within the city, work within the city, raise children within the city. It's actually a nice environment for young people to live in. It's not the same in the centre of Leeds, I'm sorry to say. And I think if you're going to do that, I would disagree with it. It's not going down the semi and detached route because we're only going to get a few of those. It's about making the high density developments family friendly.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to say, just to comfort Councillor Campbell and members, those issues that Councillor Campbell raises are at the forefront of our thinking around Leeds Local Plan 2040, and actually looking at not building sites within the city centre and the city centre fringe, but actually building neighbourhoods. And you can see some of that starting to emerge with the opening of Air Park around Meadow Lane, the significant amount of green space that's being invested in the city to the south of the river, but also to the introduction of the intent to build schools around the situ site to actually bring that social infrastructure in as well. So that's very much the lens through which we are looking at development within and around the city centre. I think there has been quite, I suppose, a market-led supply of build to rent, which has been a tenure which I think previous government and the city council have been keen to support in order to actually get numbers to actually address the housing targets and the housing crisis. But obviously there's issues with that. We've talked about the issue of bedroom sizes, but there's also issues around delivery of affordable housing off the back of that type of development. So these are very much things that we're leaning into through this plan. So I'm very hopeful that your concerns won't be sort of borne out by this plan, and that this plan will sort of provide that kind of mixed neighbourhood approach that you're looking for in the city centre.
Thank you, Chair. We're going slightly off piste, but I'm going to continue in that vein, if that's okay. Because well, I was going to make these points somewhere anyway, but it's following on from what colleagues have said, and I think these discussions highlight that there's a danger, and this needs to be reflected in any letters that are going, that we don't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. That it's not really the planning system that's the problem in not enough houses being built. It's the fact that the development industry will build as many houses as they can build for a 25% plus margin. And where they'd much rather do that on green fields and green belts because it's cheaper. And in those circumstances, the best margin is in a 5-bedroom executive home. In inner city areas, the best margin is in build them high density. And that's what's driving the market and the housing delivery, and all the tinkering around with shall we build on the grey belt and things. It's not going to change that. And there isn't suddenly more builders to build things. There isn't suddenly more electricians. There isn't suddenly cheaper bricks and supplies available because we've changed the planning system. The fundamentals are actually about making the infrastructure requirements different, and that's the biggest thing government could do actually to help, is around infrastructure. And we need to meet the developers halfway, because they're not suddenly going to change their model. There are, I think, last check, about 33,000 live planning consents yet to be built or started in the city, 1.3 million in the country as a whole. So it's not the planning system that's not delivering places to build. The builders aren't building them for a variety of reasons, mainly because they can't make their margin where they want to, and they're just going to keep banking more and more and more consents. They won't build a single extra house with amenities and all the things that go with it unless they can make the margin that they want, and that's the fundamental that needs addressing. And I hope when we're writing we can reflect those things back, that just suddenly saying, well, we'll have lots more permissions on the green belt, all that's going to do is stop building on brownfield land. It won't build any extra houses. They'll just move from there to there, and not solving anybody's problem.
Slightly off piece, but I'll make it really short. I think to pick up a bit, obviously that bit we're talking about general density, but also, and it was an interesting conversation we had at another committee about, for example, future-proofing houses in terms of an aging population. So, for example, we were having an update from our adaptions team, and they basically said they almost have absolutely no input into planning conversations with the council. They do with our housing growth team, but not with planning and planning permissions, and actually future-proofing properties so that people can age and live longer in their property to make those sustainable communities we're talking about in the other item does need to be part of that wider conversation of where housing go, but also the type of housing. Does it make sure it has the proper wide doors for people that might need wheelchairs and mobility scooters? Is it in those areas that means actually you can future-proof it so that we're also building in resilience for the council and other council services going forward, so that they're not ending up needing more intensive adult social care interventions, going into expensive facilities. So I take that goes into the local plan bit, but again, that more holistic approach to where that land is, but also the type of properties and how they're future proofed, I think is quite important. And recognizing that the city centre is turning into a retirement community. They're vertical bungalows. And actually we need to start asking developers as they're building those, taking the point about cost and density, that actually people are aging in the city centre now, and that needs to be taken into account in terms of the type of building and the density that we have there.
Well, before you do, let me just dive in. I think this is part of a larger discussion, isn't it? and we're not so much off piste now as
On a different page.
we've moved to the beach and a sunbathing. But I think it really worries me when you say things like that, because it reflects what I think is a number of issues in relation to, with the best will in the world, the planning department being in a bit of a silo. And so there are a whole raft of people that notionally we should be consulting with, and notionally, if they came back, we would change. My favourite, of course, is the Health Authority, you know, because we always get this thrown at us, don't we, about there's no doctor's surgery. Actually, theoretically, we consult the Health Authority and they should come back to us and say, yeah, you need a space, or we need a contribution. So I think there is, I'll look at you here, Jonathan. I think there is a case for a looking at how various elements of the council interact and respond to planning applications, because there do seem to be gaps highlighted there, and I'll touch on the one about a doctor's surgery. Just the final one, going back to affordability, and the thing that really irritates me most of all about the city centre developments, the profit. And if there was something that government could do, they would say to the what's his name now? Anyway, in relation to affordability. So we had the situation, the unprecedented situation a couple of months ago, where a company came to us and wanted to build the tallest, highest density block of flats that we've got in Leeds. Okay? But they couldn't do it because it wasn't affordable. So we had to give them a subsidy. And the subsidy was we set back on the affordables, and we cut down the green space round about it. Now, if you cannot build a block of flats, which is the biggest block with the most units, and you can't make money, well, you can't make 20%. You can't make 20%. There's something wrong.
Just without taking too much time, just on Councillor Ray's point about adaptable housing, we have a policy in the plan on adaptable housing, and we have a target which we report to scrutiny. And we're in excess of that target at the moment. So I'm not really quite sure, Councillor Ray, why you're hearing that from the adaptations team, because we spent a long time sort of formulating that policy with them. But it's a good point to raise, because it goes back to Councillor Lamb's point about, well, who's going to deliver these 300 houses a year that the government have an aspiration for. And I think the route through that is in terms of breaking that down into specialist housing types. And that's exactly what we've done through the strategic housing market assessment. So we're working very closely with Unipol, looking at purpose-built student accommodation, which not only provides for their needs, but also frees up private rented sector housing for others. We're working very closely with colleagues in regeneration and asset management on an affordable housing strategy, which sort of works very closely with what Executive Board approved last year in terms of that partnership plan. And we're also working very closely with our ageing friendly colleagues to look at the needs of older people. So, and I think if you start to break down these slightly large housing numbers into different routes and outlets, different developers will deliver those different products, and they'll actually make money out of them by delivering more specific and specialist products. So what we want this plan to be is one which is a lot more specific in terms of the type of housing being built, not just an overall housing target that we leave to the market to tell us what they're prepared to build. So I think all the comments that I've been hearing today around sort of concerns around mix and type, we're definitely looking to address those through a policy formation. And just to finish, I think there's an intent in the September meeting, which will be before the material is considered in depth for the consultation, for you to get to grips with some of the evidence that we've been talking about today. And I think that it will be quite beneficial, I think, for you to see that in advance, so that you can hopefully sort of see how that evidence, not only on the green belt, but also on our housing intents, is coming to bear on this plan. Thank you.
Right then. back to the presentation. That slight detour. And I think some of the bullet points on here touch on what we've just been discussing.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. So yeah, so we well, some of you in this room will have been part of we had 5 workshops with the members of development plan panel between January and March this year, which weren't trying to cover all of the sort of broad range of the topics in the local plan 2040, but just sort of picking on some of the sort of the key bits of work and evidence and the sort of emerging issues and ideas that are coming through that, and that's been really helpful in helping to sort of focus the development of that evidence and sort of what might be potential options for consultation, but also identifying areas where additional clarity, detail is needed. And I think there's a number of messages that are sort of that those workshops have helped to clarify, and I think they really reflect the conversation we've had just now about that importance of the plan being based on joined up working, looking at strategy for all of Leeds. Different parts of the city will have different needs and requirements, and the plan needs to reflect that, and being based on that requirement for housing at a local level, delivering more affordable housing, but also looking at employment opportunities and the need for sort of balance between both strategic sites but also protecting local employment opportunities. Understanding viability and what that means for what developments can and should be bringing to a place, as well as more broadly the links between public transport infrastructure as it currently is, future investment in things like mass transits, and how that might relate to locations for future growth. And more generally, I guess it's that understanding of what the capacity of infrastructure in the city is at the moment and what's going to need to be provided alongside new development to support that.
You've partially raised the point I was going to make. When we were going through these workshops, we agreed that we would have a specific session on transport, which we've not had. And if we're trying to get some work done in September, I personally don't want to delay it. Do we not need to try and get that discussion in place between now and September? And I accept that August is a time when, well, particularly council officers go off and get some holidays. Never mind elected members trying to do the same things, but do we not need to get that in place? And particularly with yesterday's announcement by the mayor on what she's planning to do, we need to, I think, have one is the council obviously need a response that they will be submitting into, but secondly, we need to look at what the effect on development is going to be. For example, do we have a plan that wherever in the first phase, wherever mass transit's going, we will have a zone 10 minutes either side, and that's where the housing should go, because that would make sense because they've got immediate access to public transport infrastructure. And then you phase your development sites as future legs come on, because it's meant to be up to 2040. So you could have another area that's coming on towards the end. Is that, how can we have that debate and discussion?
You raise a very good point, Councillor Anderson, and apologies. I think a few months ago, I think following that last workshop, I think myself, Councillor Gruen, the former chair, and Councillor Carlisle attempted to find a slot, I think, for a further discussion. We didn't quite manage to do so, and I think on my fault, the thread probably dropped a little bit. So it's a very helpful reminder that we need to pick that back up. I think we're also in a really good time to do that, particularly, as you say, with the announcement on mass transit and that start of that consultation. So we'll take that away and try and formulate what the best kind of medium for that kind of discussion is and who should be there. But I think you're absolutely right that there is, as points that Councillor Carlisle had also raised previously in terms of corridors, not necessarily just for mass transit, but for other high capacity sort of public transport corridors as well. So yeah, we'll take that away and we'll be successful this time around where we failed last time around to get something in the diary. Noting, however, like you say, August isn't necessarily the best month for doing it, but we'll see what we can work with during that time and see what we can come back with.
Yeah, thank you. It was just to come back directly on the mass transit point, and work is underway to ensure that any mass transit delivery isn't simply a line and a series of stations. There's more thought given to economic growth and spatial planning considerations to actually get the best and maximise that infrastructure that's being delivered. So that thinking's going on at the moment within the council and with the combined authority.
Before is your comment on this same topic, can we save the thoughts? Go on very quick then.
Are we giving a weighting in the site assessments to the mass transit routes?
I think short answer is no, not at the moment. I think the difficulty is that we'll need to produce a plan which is sound and adoptable in advance of potentially mass transit being signed off and agreed through its Transport and Works Act order. So there's a balancing exercise there to be done in terms of not asking an inspector to agree to something that might only be made sustainable by the presence of a mass transit station or line. So we'll need to be aware of that as we go through. That will partly be an issue of timing, but it might be an issue for us in terms of how we write some of these policies and how land is potentially released for development through site requirements. But at the moment, we're a long way off being able to say, this is actually happening here, therefore we can apply a score to a particular site.
Okay, we'll get something planned, hopefully for majority of people over the next month or so to look at transport workshop. Back to the presentation.
So we've picked up on some of this already, actually. So I think, so yeah, there's a wide range of studies that we've been sort of, I guess, over the last year, we've been really focusing on developing that really strong evidence base to underpin the plan. And that's really important to making sure that that plan is based on a really clear, robust understanding of the future needs, opportunities, challenges for Leeds. And also, importantly, one of the tests of soundness that plans are ultimately judged against is whether the plan's justified, and having that clear evidence to justify it is really sort of critical to that. So there's been a wide range of studies underway over the last year or so. As we've sort of picked up on earlier, we've been doing a strategic housing market assessment, or SHMAR, which is providing real sort of locally specific evidence of housing needs. So whilst the government has a sort of standard methodology for calculating what housing needs for a district or city are as a whole, the SHMAR gives us that really locally specific evidence about what the details of that need are, what type of houses, what size, what tenure, what are those specialist needs and how much. And that means that the plan can be much more specific about those. And as we sort of picked up on before, it identifies the real significance of the scale of need for affordable housing, but also more generally a need to increase and diversify the supply of specialist housing for older persons, which again, I think we've picked up in discussion, and an increase in accessible dwellings. Alongside that, we've been doing an employment land needs assessment, which I guess is a similar sort of study looking at what the needs are in terms of land for both sort of commercial office type developments, but also general industry, and what their requirements are in terms of how much land is needed for those uses to support the growth and expansion of businesses over the plan period. And that's really identifying a likely need for the plan to be looking at identifying additional land for general industrial purposes between now and 2040. As we've sort of discussed, we've also been doing an urban capacity study. So again, reflecting that few sites within the urban area were submitted through the call for sites, but it's really important to have an understanding of what is the capacity within the urban area. We've been sort of going proactively out to look using sort of digital technologies to identify sites that might merit further investigation and assessment. And through that process, we've identified about 100 potential sites for further detailed analysis. So as Paul says, it's a lot of the sites that are there, they're already in the system somewhere, so we already know about them, but there have been a few additional ones identified through that process, which we'll be looking at. And we've also been doing a Greenbelt review. And as we've sort of touched on this earlier, but that's looking more strategically at broad parcels of land around settlements and how they meet those Greenbelt objectives. And that the outcomes of that will help to inform discussions about the role of the Greenbelt in the plan in future. If we move to the next slide, Adam. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, there's also been a minerals needs assessment, which is looking at the need for minerals over the plan period. And I think that work's still ongoing, but what it is showing is that at a regional level, there's an overall balance in the supply and demand for minerals, which likely means that the need for minerals in this plan period is likely to be additional demands much over and above what we've already got consented or in the system. And similarly for waste, with the Leeds recycling and energy recovery facility and the Skelton Gate energy from waste facility having been built quite recently, it means that likely that what the plan's going to be looking for over the next period is more smaller scale facilities for specific waste streams, so things like glass recycling or green waste composting, rather than sort of large scale facilities like we've had coming forward in the past. We're also doing an infrastructure study, which is looking at what the infrastructure needs arising for future development will be. That work's also ongoing, and I think it'll be split into phases. So with the first phase looking at what the existing position is in terms of capacity infrastructure. Then as the plan develops, we've got more clarity about how much development's going to be happening in different locations. It'll be able to look in more detail about, well, what does that mean in terms of what infrastructure is required and what are the mechanisms for securing that? And finally, the last one I sort of flagged on these slides is the sustainability appraisal, which is a really sort of central tool to all of plan making, which is looking at the social, environmental and economic effects of all of the options we look at in the plan. So that'll be assessing all of the options that we're looking at as alongside of a reasonable alternatives. And it really helps to make sure that decisions we're making through the plan consider their impact and how they relate to wider sustainability objectives.
The other thing is, Councillor Lennox and I were at a meeting the other day at WICA where they were discussing a number of these things. And Councillor Lennox doesn't necessarily have the same concern as I had, which is, are the local authorities building up towards WICA or WICA following? Because at the moment, we've got two different plans. They were talking about identifying strategic locations for their investment plans, as it were, which might be different from ours because they have business partners who are guiding them down there on. We've not had the benefit of having business partners talking to us about where they see things going. That's not to say that these discussions aren't taking place elsewhere in the council, but we as the decision-making body are not party to those debates and discussions that are taking place. So how are we going to take in, because I mean the government themselves have made it very clear that they see the locals' economic strategy as being probably their number one building block going forward, and so there's going to have to be a lot of more work done on that. How are we going to bring that into this discussion?
Yeah, just to say, Councillor Anderson, that we are aware of, certainly from a place-based perspective, where the combined authority is seeking to prioritise different places, either be it for economic growth or other purposes. And these generally tend to be sites that are within the plan already. So there tend to be existing allocations that have been through this panel and been adopted by the City Council, but for whatever reason, be they stalled or needing some extra support from the combined authority, they're then put through that route. So those conversations are held with city development and office.
In her manifesto and in her commitments, she is going for, I think it's 5,000 affordable housing. I think that's what she said the other day. 5,000 affordable housing. Now, that's at a West Yorkshire level. Now, I think Leeds will be able to contribute quite a bit towards that overall target, but how much? So that we can make sure that if we are, for example, I'm not suggesting we should take 60%, but if we were deciding we were going to take 60% of it, how does that fit in with our other strategies in terms of, because you need to identify land specifically for it. Someone mentioned, I think it was Peter mentioned, say someone was saying in his area, as long as they were getting affordable housing, they might accept development in the green belt for that specific purpose. So it's how are we going to bring, what I'm talking about is how do we bring all of these conversations in, because the mayor was elected by a massive number of people who backed her 5,000 strategy. So how are we going to play our part in delivering that.
So again, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Anderson, the council's been quite involved in the combined authorities housing strategy, and was also involved in the understanding the mayoral pledges and the 5,000. But I think that's around conversations with the combined authority about what's already in local authorities plans, and what they're feeling about how they might need to stretch those targets are, because certainly we've made no secret within this plan that we're discussing here that we'd like to see more affordable housing being delivered, and the strategic housing market assessment actually increases in terms of a need the proportion of affordable housing that Leeds needs to deliver. So the ambition is aligned, but it's really for each local authority's local plans to set those numbers within their statutory frameworks, rather than be beholden to a number within the combined authorities housing strategy. Albeit there have been conversations about the realistic setting of that.
Yeah, it's just pick up on a comment about the waste. Obviously, we've got, you mentioned the lathe, not quite complete, but well under construction, waste to energy centre, Skeleton and Grange. I suppose my question on it is, you don't foresee any other large scale sites. I'm just conscious of whereas we start to roll out things like Leeds pipes to larger areas, as other parts of the city may come onto more dense development subject to whatever the plans develop, actually there's going to be a greater demand for that type of facility, bearing in mind the amount it does in terms of reducing carbon demand, providing heat. So why is it in your estimation at the moment, based on what you've done so far, that you don't feel that you need to think about that going further ahead, when there's obviously quite a clear demand, particularly from industrial providers and large scale anchor organisations that find that type of facility quite useful in terms of their energy demand?
Thank you, Councillor Ray. I think part of the answer is that those facilities still have a massive capacity left to go at, and this plan is looking towards 2040, and that's kind of, it's not a hard stop, but that is the plan period. So that's the evidence base that we consider. Part of it as well is that we know that the government, the previous government, were putting legislation in terms of district heating zones. Now, obviously, we wait to see whether that process will be taken forward by the current government. But what that meant was that it was far more likely that such facilities would be supported, particularly in urban areas. So I think those two things, I think, make it less of a concern that we're going to run out of capacity for a district heating basis, because I think at the moment we are, I think the stats show we are kind of importing from beyond our district to be able to, you know, at the moment we could easily just stick within our own if we really wanted to, but clearly, you know, waste can be a profitable venture. So, you know, that's an important consideration. I think we can always keep that under review, though. I think if the beauty of the plan making system is that we can do that regular review to see, you know, whether it's looking like we're hitting a ceiling in terms of that capacity, and if that then would require us to allocate more land, then we can do so through that process. But yeah, the suggestion at the moment is that we're not close to that capacity.
Councillor Lennox.
Sorry, we kind of moved on now. I was coming off the back of what Councillor Anderson started to talk about in terms of the 5,000 affordable houses at Wyker and how that does include all of our numbers. Martin kind of explained it further, but we've moved on a bit now.
Can I just ask about the minerals? Can I get it clear in my mind what I think he said, which was, in effect, the capacity we've identified in the current plan will meet the needs for 2040, and therefore we don't need to identify other areas of potential mining for gravel, etc.
Yeah, I think the work we're doing on minerals is still ongoing at the moment, but I think just looking at the regional supply, because I think when you're planning for minerals, it's kind of often done on a larger than local level, and when you look at the supply of minerals at the regional level, I think there's been some large consents in other authorities quite recently, which meant there is that sort of overall balance in supply. So I think the early indications from that work is that there's unlikely to be significant additional needs required from Leeds. But I think that it's one of the sort of pieces of work that's at sort of slightly earlier stage of the process at the moment. So that'll sort of be clarified as we sort of continue that work and finalise it. But certainly looking at that regional position and where we're at the moment, I think that's our expectation what will come out of that work. We'll obviously bring that, you know, once that's completed, we'll be bringing that back to DPP as well as part of the sort of before we take out the plan for consultation.
Okay, back to your presentation.
So if I move on to the next slide then, Adam. Yeah, so what we're intending is that particularly when planning for housing, there's real benefits as we see it to breaking Leeds as a sort of large district, which is sort of made up of a variety of different communities, neighbourhoods, settlements of different characters and requirements, sort of breaking that down. And I think it helps to reflect the complexity of Leeds as a district. But I think it also gives benefits in terms of providing more clarity to communities about what's likely to happen around where they live in their areas. And also, I think picking up again on what we've discussed previously in terms of some of the challenges we have with applications, perhaps as they come forward, it helps to ensure that alignment between local needs, what's needed in different areas, which is likely to vary, and the allocation of sites. And I think, you know, through the plan, we've certainly got an aspiration to be more specific about what we're seeking from those sites and allocations. And we can sort of back that up with policy as well, so that there's a sort of more tailored approach, which really makes sure that the development that is happening in different places is helping to meet the needs of those places. And the approach that we're taking to that is it's largely based on the community committee areas which are used by the council for other purposes. So we've sort of taken the city centre out of that and extracted that separately, really just because the types of development that are likely to occur in the city centre are different to those that might happen elsewhere. So I think there was sort of sense in planning terms from looking at that separately in terms of what the needs are and then what the sort of how policy responds to that. And as we sort of picked up, the strategic housing market assessment is based on very much a bottom-up approach to establishing what those local needs are, and we'll be using that to sort of through the plan reflecting distinctiveness and the different needs in different parts of the area. So perhaps unlike what we did through the site allocations plan, where it was a bit more of a top-down approach, we had an overall housing figure for Leeds and then that got broken up between the housing market areas largely based on supply. This time round, we'll be using those areas to sort of build up based on local needs. Well, what are the proportions of the overall amount of development that's going to happen across Leeds? What are the proportions that will take place in different parts of the city?
Before you move on, Councillor Ray.
Yeah, I think any of us who represent the city centre or just have a general interest in city will obviously be really curious to see how you've broken down the city centre, because the city centre, I think, is far more complex, particularly from a residential perspective, than is given credit for. And certainly, you've obviously looked at you look at the community committees, and certainly one of the big gaps we found in how we engage with the city centre is that the community committees basically ignore the city centre exists. The understanding of what the city centre is, the complexity of the populations, the fact that there's very high churn rate in, say, one part of the city centre, my part, which is mainly permanent residents, but that's people building hopping, not leaving the city centre as they grow and develop families, whereas other parts of the city centre are obviously more student-based, more short-term letting, and the complexities of that. So I think what my concern is around that, and I'd obviously be keen at a late stage to see some of the information for that, is actually, are we picking up the actual sheer complexity of the city centre? Not just because it's complex, because it's hospitality, residential, office, but actually complex in dynamic of the residential population, because the residential population always seems to come very much last in any of our planning conversations, either in planning terms or strategically as a council, because there's still this siloed perspective of the city centre being somewhere where 20-year-olds live or people go to just to have a party. And actually not that, it's a really substantially complex set of communities now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think what I should have said, which I think I did say in the paper, was that, you know, I think we recognise that these areas they're not little islands, they're not silos, they have a really important, and I think that relationship between the city centre, the urban fringe around it, and the sort of the surrounding areas, I think there's complexity there, which I think these areas can perhaps provide a starting point for looking at what needs are and how they might vary in different places. But I think we need to layer in, I guess, the reality of how a city functions, and it isn't about specific, you can't just draw a boundary around that. We'll need to think about that. And I think that will come through, well, it will need to come through how we plan for sort of different types of developments in different places and how that might vary, not just focus solely on those boundaries.
Just very, very quick, and I mean, just the level I was speaking to my public health officer, and they haven't done a health needs assessment for the city centre. So when you are having these conversations, there's a whole system within the council that just sort of ignores there's 40 odd thousand people that live in that area. So when you are having those conversations, I think it's important that actually it is pulling in from the other parts of the council, because there are blind spots within the authority's approach to the city centre which perhaps are not feeding through to the planning system.
It's yours on this point, Councillor Lance. Councillor Lennox wants to come in, I think, on this point.
It's on this issue, not that specific point.
Councillor Lennox, is yours on this specific? Can we take this one first then, Councillor Lance?
Sorry, thank you. Just to say that, just to back what Councillor Ray was saying in terms of thinking about this, in terms of, as Councillor Anderson mentioned when we were at WICA the other day, they were also talking about place rather than just units. And this is what we need to be considering, especially if we are to be delivering 20,000 homes in the Leeds transformative regeneration work that's happening, 20,000 city centre homes in the coming few years. That can't just be get the units up there and let people move into them. We need to do a lot to back him up on that.
Okay, Councillor Lamb.
Yeah, thank you. I think broadly this is a much more comfortable approach than the HMCAs and fair shares and everything we went through before. I said the devil's in the detail, and the question is around how the settlement hierarchies fit into this. And there's an ongoing concern that in some cases, if you constantly stick with settlement hierarchies, there are settlements who have a natural limit because of historic bridges and features, rivers, just natural topography. But if we purely go, Wetherby and Boston Spa in my areas are examples where there is a physical limit. And actually, if you're going to build much more, it's going to have to be an awful lot more to deliver the infrastructure, where there are other settlements that are much lower down in the settlement hierarchy, perhaps because they don't yet have a district centre or something identifiable like that, but they're not growing at all. And there's a balance to strike, because no development is bad for an area, but equally, if you're just saying it's always going to go there, and a 10% uplift is getting bigger and bigger numbers. So it's just getting some clarity around how that will fit into this.
Yeah, I think that's sort of one of the sort of key pieces of work that we're doing at the moment, really, to sort of think about, well, now that the SHMA's more or less completed and it's telling us about those needs, we're sort of thinking about, well, what does this then mean? What in terms of, you know, for this stage in the plan, certainly what the issues are and what the options are in terms of how development's distributed to different places, and I guess looking at the pros and cons of different approaches and what those options might be. And I think that's what the next consultation that we do is it's largely going to be around, you know, these are the options for how we could go about this and what it might mean for different places. So I think we're still at quite an early point in thinking about, well, what is the strategy and what are the benefits of some potential approaches, and how does that sort of balance against other drawbacks perhaps, and overall how do we come to a consensus and agreement about what the strategy should be for development across all parts of the district in order to sort of to meet the needs and sort of the wider objectives of the plan.
Thanks. Yeah, I think just kind of further response as well is that I think when we look at more detail, I think kind of in response to your point, Councillor Lamb, that just because a settlement is sustainable doesn't mean that a site next to it is sustainable. And I think that's that nuance that we're getting to with some of the work that we've done there. And I think it's always tricky. It's always a balance. Good plan making should have a settlement hierarchy approach, but at the same time, if you've got a site that's, we've seen it through the kind of 20-minute neighbourhoods work now, the 3 Cs work. There are areas of the main urban area of Leeds that don't have good access to services. Not many, but they are there. So the assumption that all of the main urban area is equally sustainable is proven to be wrong. And similarly for kind of market towns as well. Depends how close you are to that centre, doesn't it, in terms of how sustainable you are. So we are absolutely cognizant of that, and that is part of how we're looking at sites.
Yeah, so move on, please. Thank you. So so I think, as we've alluded to there, so the plan will need to allocate specific sites for development in order to meet the needs. But I think it's important to sort of just be clear that at this stage of the plan process, we're not making decisions about which sites should be allocated. We're just looking at what the options for that would be. Now, there are some sites that have already been agreed as being suitable for development by the council. So sites that are allocated for development in the Aire Valley Leeds Area Action Plan or the Site Allocations Plan, or sites that have been granted planning permission in the last 3 years, or the sort of recent evidence that they're sort of starting to build out those sites. And we're not looking to reassess those sites through this process, but what we will do is relook at their capacity to make sure that that's taken into account when we're planning for how much additional sites or land we might need to identify through the process. And the options that we're looking at come from a sort of wide range of sources. So they include the call for sites, which we've talked about previously, as well as the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, which is a sort of bank of sites for housing specifically. Also through the Urban Capacity Study, which we've discussed, the sites that were allocated in the Unitary Development Plan, which remain undeveloped. So their sites have been allocated quite a long time ago, so we can still look at those to consider whether they're still suitable, as well as sites that have planning permission, but that's older, they've not come forward. We can relook at those. And safeguarded land. So that's land which was taken out of the Greenbelt through previous plans for potential future longer term development. So it was removed from the Greenbelt, but it wasn't specifically allocated for development. It kind of performed it's like a reserve of land, and we'll have to look at that as well as part of the process. And I think what's important to note is that the total capacity of those sites far exceeds what we're going to need to make needs, which means that the plan's going to be able to make decisions about and choices about which of those sites should be allocated. And if we move on to the next slide. Oh, yeah.
Can I just flag up the phrase second bullet point? In effect, we're saying we won't be reassessing anything. Can I just flag up that when we did this the first time around, we did move the whole of the UDP sites into the SLAR, and at least one of those had to come out because it was undevelopable, if that's a right word.
It is now.
Yeah. And at least 2 more, to my knowledge, have had to be tweaked quite considerably because they didn't work to meet modern. So I'm always slightly worried when you say we're not going to do these things, because I think you have to be prepared if evidence is brought forward that for one reason or another, these sites are not developable, then we need to be flexible enough to take them out. And to simply say, as was said when we talked about moving the UDP plans, it's okay, we don't need to worry about it, we're not going to look at it. And it comes back to bite you in the end. So I think there has to be an element of flexibility. I'm not saying we review all of them. I'm not suggesting that. And certainly those with planning permission, they're a given in my opinion, but there are 1 or 2 that I still think, well, I think I can think of one or two old UDP sites where I'm not sure they'll ever get developed because it's gone 15, 20 years and nothing's happened. So.
Yeah, I think on that, that's why we will be reviewing the capacity. So those sort of more recent sites, I think I think from a sort of legal perspective, if they've been recently allocated and the plan period for that, say, runs up to 2028, they've got a status in the plan. It's very difficult to change that. But what we can do is that if something is changed and we know that the site is no longer going to come forward, you know, the landowner is simply not interested, or perhaps the flood risk status of the site has changed, which means that it's no longer suitable for development, we can effectively, assume that when we're looking at the capacity of the site, we can assume that 0 units will come forward on that. So whereas from a sort of, I guess, from a legal perspective, they're in the plan, we're not expecting that they will come forward. So we're making sure that we are planning, you know, through the allocations that we are making, the plan is deliverable and will meet the needs in the city. But yeah, so it's a bit of a balance there.
Sorry, if you leave them in the plan, even though you're saying the assumption is there's a 0 figure on this one, doesn't that lay us open to a challenge to the inspector? You've obviously thought about this, about it. You know, because the argument, of course, will be, well, they're in the plan. Okay, you're saying, well, probably not going to get developed. So why is it still there?
I think this is a process that we need to work through and in kind of close consideration with legal colleagues. I think what Caroline's trying to outline here is essentially with kind of finite resources, how do we best use those resources to review the most relevant sites for that detailed review? So is it worth spending a huge amount of time reviewing sites that got permission a year ago? Not really. You know, is it worth reviewing sites that were allocated in the UDP, 15, 20 years ago and nothing's happened to them? Absolutely. So it's trying to sort of show that a bit of that kind of division of labour, really, and trying to just set up some handy rules for the sites that we won't look at in much detail compared to the ones that we will. And absolutely agree in terms of those UDP sites, and also those others on the list in terms of, say, an undeveloped planning permission. I think where we have an allocation, let's say through the site allocations plan, and through this process, we either realise that it's completely undevelopable for whatever reason. I think the MPPF does allow us to essentially deallocate sites, but as Caroline says, that's something not done lightly. So it's something that we'll, as I say, need to work closely through with legal colleagues. But we have the ability and the right to do that. I think the reason why Caroline mentions about having 0 capacities is I think it's a very easy criticism of a plan where we do perhaps as we previously did, where you say, well, all you're doing is just rolling forward sites that nothing's ever happened on. You're saying 150 houses are going to be built on, but they haven't happened for the last 15 years. Why should we believe it's going to happen now? That's exactly what an inspector would ask. So I think that in a way, the 0 capacity against that site is a bit of a shortcut. But I think if we do think it is appropriate in those specific circumstances to deallocate sites, and we've got the evidence to suggest that's appropriate, then we can do that. But as I say, I think we're probably still in the slightly earlier stages of knowing whether that's the right approach for some of these sites.
Yeah, so we just move on to the next slide. Thank you. So to inform, I guess, those decisions and choices about sites, we're assessing all sites on a consistent basis against a whole range of indicators that would sort of are relevant to how suitable a site is, or perhaps how unsuitable a site is for development. And I've sort of listed on the slide here, I won't read them all out to you, but you can see there's a range of factors that we're looking at as part of that. And the site assessment process that we're going through effectively scores sites against sort of all these objectives on a scale of +3 to -3, and we've got quite clear and consistent criteria to do that, and that will enable us, I guess, to come to a position about how you know, what the how a site is looking. And I think while you can total the scores for sites, and I think we will be doing that, I think it will be important to note that, you know, if you've got a site that's perhaps in a flood zone scoring really negative against that objective, then that alone, no matter what else positives it might be scoring, that alone might mean that the site is unsuitable for development. So it's a bit of a balance, but I think by sort of going through this quite objective process, looking against a whole range of different criteria, it just enables us to look and sort of compare sites on a consistent basis against each other. And what we're proposing as part of the consultation that we do, we'll publish a map of all the sites that we've been assessing as part of this alongside their initial assessment. And we'll be publishing that for, I guess, 3 key reasons we're wanting feedback as part of the consultation. I think firstly, it's that fact check of the assessment, that initial assessment. Have we got all the relevant information? Have we taken that into account when assessing the site? Are there things that we don't know about that we need to know about those sites? So that'll be sort of the first stage of it. I think the second stage, it enables us to understand the views and preferences of local communities about the potential sites in their areas and what they'd like to see happen and or not, and the reasons for that. And it finally, and I think importantly, provides an opportunity for landowners and developers to put forward proposals for how they could improve their site. You know, they've submitted to us. We've largely assessed the site based on the boundary on the plan, but they can, you know, if there's something that they can do which would make their site better, then we want to hear about that now at this stage, so we can take that into account before we make the decisions about which of these sites are sort of preferred as allocations, which would then be subject to further consultation before the plan's finalised. And if I move on, so this is the final slide. So really just in terms of the next steps. So over the coming months, we've still got a lot of work to do in terms of sort of continuing to develop and refine that evidence base for the plan, completing the assessment of all the sites that we're looking at and defining what the issues and key options for the plan would be. We're also doing a lot of work at the moment in this sort of period just between sort of year 6 SATs finishing and the summer holidays, going into I think about 15 schools across the city and engaging around 650 year 6 children as part of that process and speaking to them about what they like about where they live and what they want to see happen in Leeds in the future. I think really sort of linking into that ambition for Leeds to be a child-friendly city and making sure that the plan reflects not only what we as adults want to see happen in the city, but what children would like to see happen. Because ultimately, this is the plan for when they're going to be the people looking for these houses and hopefully staying in Leeds in the future and living in the Leeds that we're planning for. So that's a sort of really interesting piece of work that's going on at the moment. And then we're also more broadly going to be developing that engagement strategy for the consultation itself. Before we go out to consultation, we're intending to hold area-based briefings for all ward members, which will be organised on that community committee basis, just the sort of presentation material as part of that tailored to the areas in question. We're also planning to come back to DPP, hopefully in September time, with further details of the evidence-based outputs and, you know, what they're meaning in terms of proposed options for the plan, before coming back again, hopefully in November time, with a report to DPP with the proposed consultation material prior to that, to going to executive board and then out for consultation. So yes, I think that's a run through of where we're at with Local Plan 2040.
Yeah, just a really quick one on the consultations. I appreciate you doing them on community committee. Could I make a specific request that any ward that has an interest in the city centre has a separate one? Just simply because we're having this at the community committee level conversation as well about actually you've got 4 or 5 wards that segment into the city centre, and actually we could dominate an entire conversation community committee about just the city centre alone. So I know it's maybe an extra meeting for those wards, but actually having a separate one for those councillors with interest in the city centre because of the complexity of the city centre would be useful.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that will relate well to the way we're sort of structuring the plan as well. So yeah, that's fine. We can look at that.
Thank you, Chair. It's just going back to specialist housing types, and I flagged this up last time and it doesn't seem to have picked up anywhere around sort of shared living for vulnerable adults with a variety of disabilities. We talked about adaptable housing and accessible housing earlier, but there's an increasing. I have a few people that contact me who have got young people or sort of young adults who would really benefit from the sort of over 55s shared supported living that we have, but there isn't anything for them and they're excluded from that type of over 55s housing, and it just feels like there's a gap, whether there's anything in the market that fills that, or if it's something we can look at through the plan.
I'm not 100% sure, but I do recall that came up as part of our discussions on the SHMA. So I'll go back and I'll have a look at the SHMA to see how they followed through. I certainly think if the city council's getting nominations and requests, then we can certainly be in a position to capture those requests and estimate what that need may be. And as I said previously, I think there's a real intent to look at sort of breaking that housing number down. But of course, it's then not all on the council to be able to provide and build that accommodation. It's what we can do to sort of encourage the market to do that as well. But I'll take that away, Councillor.
Yeah, just if thinking about that, obviously our new bungalows that we've built down at Middleton, although they would be traditionally considered over 55s housing, they've been left to people to live independently from age 18. Is there anything that we can do to, as you say, whether that's via nominations to RPs or put into any planning like policy or planning objectives for any new plans, that they will, any accessible housing, it will obviously go according to their allocations, but that people won't be excluded from accessible housing because of age?
I agree. I'll take that away. I think that's really useful. Thank you.
I think what Councillor Lamb was getting at on that was not just accessible, but shared living for neurodivergent adults with disabilities. I know there's some around the city because a friend of ours has their 8-year-old son living in one. But how can we deal with that? Because it will become more and more of an issue. I think that's what you're getting at, isn't it, Councillor Lamb?
Yeah, the point that there's a lot of young adults who could live independently with the right level of support. And I have people that say we have some amazing over 55s shared housing with great facilities, and we've got gyms and pools and on-site restaurants and things, but they're exclusively for over 55s. And I get a lot of people that, well, our young people would that would be perfect for them, but it's not for them. And so, well, what is for them then in that case? And it's trying to capture that in the housing mix.
Okay, any final comments or questions on that presentation? No, I think you've got everybody stunned into silence, Caroline. Thank you very much for that. Right, we shall move on to the monitoring report, which is pages 39 to 202. We're going to go through every page in great detail. I hope you've read it all. Okay, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. So this item relates to the draft authority monitoring report, which is attached in the papers, and obviously brings it up to that length in those papers. In terms of the context, the purpose of authority monitoring reports is to report on the performance of specific planning policies, summarise progress on the local plan against milestones set out in the local development scheme, which is the sort of timetable for preparing local plan documents, and it provides up-to-date information on the implementation of neighbourhood plans. There's a legal requirement to publish this information annually, but the draft report goes much further than the basic legal requirements and provides information across a range of other topics. Existing local plan documents such as the core strategy include a monitoring framework, and that sets out indicators against which the effectiveness of policies is measured. For some topic areas such as housing, there's a specific target to measure delivery, for example, an annual housing requirement. As the local plan's updated, and we've discussed a couple of updates to the local plan that are in progress, the monitoring framework of those updates will be reviewed, and that will reflect new, revised or deleted policies. And then that information, data relating to that, those policies will be provided in future AMRs, and they'd be updated to reflect that. So this version of the AMR covers the 2022 to 2023 financial year, so up to the end of March 2023. As noted in the report, there's a time lag between the reporting period and the publication of the information in the AMR. And this period is used to collect and collate the data that goes into report and prepare the report itself. So the report includes a mix of data collected by council officers, such as housing and economic development approvals and completions, but it also makes use of data published by other bodies, for example, carbon emissions by local authority, which are published by the government. Some of that data might not be available for up to 6 months after the end of the period, so that causes some of the time lag we have. The AMR is a data-heavy document, given the breadth of topics covered and the information provided. We'd expect many users of the document to be seeking specific information, and in that respect, the AMR represents a single document to find data which can be referred to in other planning documents, for example, in evidence supporting the preparation of local plan updates. We've worked on revising the format of the document to hopefully help make it easy to find specific information related to topics. I think members should also be aware that the performance against some indicators can vary significantly from one year to the next. For example, housing delivery, and particularly smaller aspects of that sort of specialist housing, industrial and office completions, because they can be influenced heavily by a few large sites completing in one year and then not the next. So it's often useful to look at trends over the last 5 or 10 years, or say since the start of a plan period, to understand the general direction of travel. And the AMR documents provides that information where it's available. So in terms of the document itself, so it's divided into 12 sections. The covering report highlights some of the performance against some key indicators relating to those topics, including housing delivery, affordable housing, specialist housing delivery against targets, completions of new commercial space, including industrial and office space against targets, carbon emissions and renewable energy installations and capacity, environmental quality data, including air quality, and population and health data. Some of these are more directly related to planning than others, but they're all also relevant to the context which planning decisions take place. So we're asking members to note and comment on the contents of the report, and the AMR recognises a lot of information in the report, so I can pick up any specific questions members have on it. And finally, in terms of the next steps following DPP, the AMR document will need to be approved by the Chief Planning Officer with any necessary revisions, and then it'll be published on the Council's website in due course. Thank you.
Any comments, questions? Go.
No, but
I'll ask one and one only. Could we voluntarily put in the number of housing permissions that have been granted by the council? Because we must have tens of thousands of properties that could be built that aren't being built. So in other words, in terms of the productivity of the various plans panels, they are more than meeting, I would argue, their information. But we need to emphasise it. Look, it would appear we've not produced as many houses as we should have done last year. But that was because Leeds City Council was holding things back. It was in order to keep the price up that they were constraining the build-out rates. And we need to be able to put that in the public domain so that the public can understand that Leeds City Council have got massive stocks of houses to be built. It's the developers that are choosing, not Leeds City Council that's choosing which ones are or are not going to be built. Can we not voluntarily put that in here? I accept that statutorily we don't need to, but should we do it voluntarily?
Yeah, and I think I would agree with Baron's point. I think obviously subject to, this is another letter request, subject to what obviously happens with the King's speech, and obviously there's been some mutterings about trying to make developers actually develop the land they've developed. I think it would be a useful piece of information to supply to our colleagues in Westminster that actually the council's doing its side, but we really need legislation to change to make sure developers do their bit. And so maybe it's a request from this particular committee, or maybe it's a request from Councillor Pryor and Councillor Lennox, subject to obviously whatever comes out of the King's speech, because again, not to preempt, because we don't know ourselves yet.
No, thank you for that. I think it's covered in the report in terms of the number of approvals and the stock of permissions, but I think probably needs to be highlighted a bit more in the narrative to pick that out, to show the relationship between the two and how we're approving a lot more than are getting built on an annual basis. So I'll pick up on those comments in terms of how the report's structured, so that that comes out more. It is that the data is actually there, but I appreciate it's kind of hidden behind the raft of data that's in the report, and I think that's something we should highlight a bit more so it stands out. So I totally agree with the comments you've made there.
Isn't there also a point there on the age of those permissions as well?
Yes, so yeah, we'll look at how we can bring that out a bit more generally. I think that's another important point that is continued. The council's continuing to approve permissions, and for a number of years afterwards they're not being implemented, so it's not being reflected in delivery.
Councillor Campbell.
I think with regard to planning permissions, it would be useful if the council could insert a line in the permission which said meaningful commencement, as opposed to the digging the hole and saying we're off.
Is that one that's an example of that one?
Right. Yeah. Just a couple of quick points to get clear in my mind. Good news that we've got more affordables built. But in relation to policy terms, what should our affordable level be? And I don't think we've ever hit our policy level. We talk about the carbon emissions going up by 3.7%. Do we have any real detail as to why that is? Because my assumption would be if it's related to commercial domestic activity, I would have thought that it should be dropping because the type of vehicles used should be more or less producers of CO2. And the air quality, which is your bullet point on 39, is a bit of a tortuous sentence. But can I get it clear in my mind? So what we're saying is, in one air quality management area, the figures were below what we want, and that was meant one air quality monitoring site, presumably in that area, or is that a separate air quality monitoring site where the figures were weren't meeting the air quality objectives? And I suppose the question then is, how's that got better if we're talking about over a 5-year period? How's that got better over 5 years?
I'll come back, Chair, just on the affordable housing point. So the core strategy, Councillor Campbell, doesn't actually express the affordable housing need as a target. It expresses it as a need, and that need is for 1,230 homes a year to be affordable. But it's accepted that the plan has got limited levers to be able to deliver all of that itself. So there's a reliance on other means of delivering that. So in a sense, the performance is really sort of measured against itself, So there's been an upward trajectory of affordable housing delivery in the city. And I think in 2023-24, that actually hit 700 houses. So again, it's gone up even more. But there isn't an actual planned target for that.
I think coming back on the carbon emissions question, the data we use lags another 2 years from the base date, so it's actually data from 2021. So that was the most recent we had available, and comparing that to 2020, and I think the main difference in the 2 years was the COVID-19 related lockdowns, and the emissions on transport went up between 2020 and 2021 for sort of obvious reasons, I think. Yeah. For that figure, yeah. So yeah, I think I probably need to make that clearer. So it's just the figures for 2021 are released in 2023, and the next time we report it'll be 2022. So it does, the release of the data does like a couple of years behind the rest of the data that's in here. I think in terms of the air quality, it's not clearly written. So I think there are 6 monitoring stations, and 5 of those have meet this better than the standard, and 1 isn't. So there's 1 monitoring station in each of the 6 areas. 5 of them meet the standard and 1 doesn't, I think is what it should say. Does that clarify it?
Just let me say what I think you've just said. So in every management area, there are 6 monitoring stations.
No, there's
right,
one.
okay.
There's one.
There's 1 monitoring station in each management area, and in one of those management areas, the the monitoring station is showing figures that are above. Right. Okay.
Any other questions? No? Right, thank you very much for that, Paul. And that is the final item. So thank you very much to the officers for presenting there and taking the questions. So date and time of next meeting is down for the 17th of September at 1:30. But as we said, we'll work on getting a workshop based around what's happening with transport at some point over August, and hopefully as many as possible can attend that. Thank you very much for your attendance, and to anybody who's been watching online, thank